The drilling stopped at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon. After 6 weeks of careful, methodical work through solid limestone, the specialized equipment had finally broken through into empty space. Dr. Marcus Whitfield felt his heart racing as he stepped back from the machinery, wiping the dust from his protective goggles. The October wind howled across the remote canyon in southern Utah, carrying with it the scent of sage and ancient rock. What lay beyond that narrow opening would either validate 20 years of his academic career or reduce it to an embarrassing footnote in archaeological journals. The discovery had begun with a student. A graduate researcher named Timothy Brennan had been analyzing satellite thermal imagery of the region when he noticed an anomaly. The rock face showed a temperature variation that suggested a void space behind it. At first, Marcus had dismissed it as nothing more than a natural cavity, the kind that peppered this limestone formation like Swiss cheese, but Timothy had been persistent, almost obsessively so. He had spent 3 months compiling geological surveys, historical records, and indigenous oral histories that all pointed to something significant hidden in this particular canyon wall. The canyon itself was unremarkable to the casual observer. Steep walls of pale limestone rose 200 feet on either side, carved by water that had long since found other paths through the desert. Juniper trees clung to impossible angles on the canyon floor, their twisted trunks testament to decades of harsh survival. The nearest town, a place called Redstone with a population of just under 300, lay 40 miles to the east. The isolation was complete, which made the next discovery all the more puzzling. When Marcus finally peered through the opening with a high-powered flashlight, his breath caught in his throat. The beam revealed not a natural cavity, but a passageway. The walls were too smooth, too regular to be the work of erosion alone. Someone had modified this space, perhaps even created it entirely. But the real shock came when he examined the opening itself. The ancient peoples who had sealed this cave had done so with a level of sophistication that seemed impossible for the timeline he understood. The seal had been a complex arrangement of fitted stone blocks, each one precisely shaped and positioned. Behind these blocks, they had packed a mixture of crushed limestone, plant resin, and something else Marcus could not immediately identify. The chemical analysis would come later, but even without it, he could see that whoever had closed this cave had wanted it to stay closed. They had wanted to ensure that whatever lay inside remained undisturbed for a very, very long time. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived 2 days later. Marcus had called her immediately after the breakthrough, knowing he needed someone with her expertise. Elena specialized in prehistoric sealed environments, a niche field that had taken her from the depths of French cave systems to the high-altitude shelters of the Andes. She was a small woman with intense, dark eyes and hands that moved constantly when she talked, sketching shapes in the air to illustrate her points. When she saw the opening, those hands fell still. "This should not be possible," she said quietly, running her gloved fingers along the edge of the seal. The precision of this work, the materials they used, the understanding of how to create an airtight barrier. "Marcus, this is Bronze Age technology at minimum. But if your dating is correct, if this really was sealed 10,000 years ago, we are looking at something that predates the Bronze Age by 6,000 years. The implications hung in the cold desert air between them. Elena did not say the words that they were both thinking. If this seal was truly 10,000 years old, it suggested that early humans in North America possessed technological knowledge that had been completely lost to history. It meant that everything they thought they understood about the development of human civilization might need to be reconsidered. Professor Raymond Holloway joined the team on the 4th day. Raymond was 73 years old, with a reputation for being difficult and a track record of being right. He had spent his career studying the peopling of the Americas, fighting academic battles over migration patterns and technological development. When Marcus showed him the preliminary radiocarbon dates from the organic material in the seal, Raymond's weathered face showed no emotion. He simply nodded once and said, "We need to be very careful about what we say and when we say it. Until we know what is inside that cave, we tell no one outside this team." The decision to enter the cave was not made lightly. Every archaeologist understands the tension between the desire to discover and the need to preserve. Modern techniques allow for non-invasive exploration, remote sensing that can map interior spaces without ever setting foot inside them. But the limestone walls of the canyon interfered with ground-penetrating radar. The thermal imaging that had revealed the cave's existence could not penetrate deep enough to show what lay within. If they wanted answers, someone would have to go inside. They spent a week preparing. The opening was carefully enlarged, each stone documented and photographed before removal. An air quality monitoring system was installed to track oxygen levels and detect any dangerous gases that might have accumulated over millennia. Biological containment protocols were established. Whatever ecosystem had evolved in that sealed darkness needed to be protected as much as the human explorers needed to be kept safe. Marcus insisted on being the first to enter. It was his project, his responsibility. Elena argued briefly but understood. She would monitor from outside, ready to assist if anything went wrong. Timothy, the graduate student whose persistence had started everything, would document every moment with multiple cameras. The passage beyond the seal sloped downward at a gentle angle. Marcus moved slowly, his headlamp casting strange shadows on walls that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The stone underfoot was worn smooth, polished by the passage of countless feet across centuries, or perhaps millennia before, the cave was sealed. The air tasted strange, flat and lifeless, untouched by the world above for 10,000 years. After 30 feet, the passage opened into a chamber. Marcus stopped at the threshold, letting his light sweep across the space. The chamber was roughly circular, about 40 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that rose to a natural dome, perhaps 20 feet overhead. But it was what filled the chamber that made Marcus forget to breathe. The walls were covered in paintings, not primitive stick figures or simple handprints, but sophisticated artworks that displayed an understanding of perspective, shading, and proportion that should not have existed in this time period. Animals moved across the stone canvas in fluid motion, their bodies rendered with anatomical precision. Human figures danced, hunted, and gathered in scenes of daily life that were both familiar and utterly alien. But that was not the most disturbing discovery. In the center of the chamber sat an object that Marcus could not immediately classify. It was roughly spherical, about 3 feet in diameter, constructed from some material that his light could not quite penetrate. The surface appeared to be covered in symbols or writing, arranged in spiraling patterns that drew the eye inward toward a central point. Around this object, arranged in a careful circle, were 12 smaller items. They looked like tools, but tools of a design and purpose that Marcus did not recognize. "Elena," Marcus said into his radio, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this." Over the next 3 days, the team documented every inch of the chamber with obsessive care. High-resolution photography captured the paintings from every angle. The mysterious central object was scanned with portable X-ray equipment, though the results were frustratingly inconclusive. The material seemed to absorb the X-rays rather than allowing them to pass through or reflect back. The 12 surrounding objects were carefully examined but not yet moved. Raymond insisted they understand the context before disturbing anything. Elena focused on the paintings, and what she found both excited and troubled her. The artistic techniques on display were sophisticated, yes, but more than that, they were consistent. Every human figure was rendered in the same style, with the same proportions and the same level of detail. The animals were all species that should have existed in North America 10,000 years ago: mammoths, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, and American lions moved across the walls in scenes that could have been documentary footage from the Pleistocene epoch. But there were also things that did not fit. Some of the paintings showed the night sky, constellations rendered with careful attention to the position of individual stars. Elena was no astronomer, but she recognized that the patterns did not match the current night sky. When she sent the images to a colleague who specialized in archaeoastronomy, the response came back within hours. The star patterns matched the sky as it would have appeared approximately 10,000 years ago, accounting for the precession of Earth's axis. The accuracy was startling. Even more puzzling were a series of paintings that seemed to show some kind of ceremony or ritual. Human figures stood in a circle around something that looked disturbingly similar to the mysterious object in the center of the chamber. Their postures suggested reverence or perhaps fear. Some held their hands raised toward the sky, while others appeared to be prostrating themselves on the ground. Above them, the artist had painted something that Elena struggled to interpret. It could have been meant to represent the sun or perhaps the moon, but the rays or beams that emanated from it were rendered in a way that suggested something more complex, something that the artist had struggled to convey with the available techniques. Timothy, meanwhile, had become obsessed with the symbols on the central object. He spent hours photographing them from every angle, trying to identify any patterns or repetitions that might suggest they were a form of writing. What he discovered was both fascinating and frustrating. There were approximately 400 distinct symbols visible on the surface of the object. Some appeared multiple times in different arrangements, which suggested they might be phonetic or ideographic characters. But there was no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text that would allow for translation. The symbols were utterly unlike any known writing system from this time period, or indeed from any time period. On the seventh day inside the cave, Raymond made a discovery that changed everything. He had been examining the floor of the chamber, looking for any artifacts that might have been dropped or deliberately placed there. In the far corner, partially hidden by a small rock formation, he found a narrow crack in the floor. When he shone his light into it, he realized it was not a crack, but another passage, this one descending more steeply into the earth. The team gathered around the opening. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and the angle of descent was concerning. If someone went down and encountered trouble, extraction would be difficult at best. But the scientific curiosity that drives all archaeologists was a fire that burned too hot to ignore. After a brief discussion, they agreed that Marcus and Elena would make the descent together, roped and with constant communication to the surface team. The passage was tight and uncomfortable. Marcus led the way, his shoulders scraping against stone that felt unnaturally smooth. The descent seemed to go on forever, though his GPS tracker showed they had only gone about 50 feet deeper into the earth. Then, abruptly, the passage opened into a second chamber. This chamber was smaller than the first, perhaps 20 feet across, and the ceiling was lower, only about 8 feet high. But what it contained made the discoveries in the upper chamber seem almost mundane by comparison. The walls here were not painted, but carved, covered in a three-dimensional relief that depicted a story. And unlike the paintings above, this story was clear and terrifying. The carvings showed a sequence of events. In the first panel, people lived in harmony with the land, hunting and gathering, their lives following the rhythms of the seasons. The second panel showed the arrival of something. The carvers had rendered it as a shape that seemed to shift depending on the angle of the light, but the reaction of the human figures was unmistakable. Fear, awe, and wonder were captured in carved stone with heartbreaking clarity. The subsequent panels showed the object being brought into the cave, the same object that now sat in the chamber above. The carvings depicted people working together to seal the cave, their faces showing grim determination. The final panel was the most disturbing. It showed the sealed cave from the outside, with the sun and moon passing overhead in a cycle that was repeated 12 times. Around the sealed entrance, the carvers had placed a border of symbols that Marcus recognized from the central object. Below these symbols, they had carved a single image that needed no translation. It was a hand, palm outward, in the universal gesture that meant stop or stay away, but there was more in this lower chamber. Against one wall stood a series of clay vessels sealed with the same resin compound that had been used in the cave entrance. Next to these vessels lay 3 human skeletons, arranged with obvious care. The bodies had been placed in flexed positions, knees drawn up to their chests, and covered with what remained of woven textiles. Next to each skeleton lay tools and what appeared to be personal possessions. These were not random remains. This was a deliberate burial. Helena knelt beside the nearest skeleton, her professional detachment struggling against the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. These people had sealed themselves in here. They had brought the object into this cave, performed whatever ritual was necessary, and then chosen to remain with it for eternity. The implications were staggering. What could have been so important that 3 people would voluntarily entomb themselves alive? What did they know about the object that made such a sacrifice necessary? The team spent the next 2 weeks working in shifts, documenting everything with painstaking detail. Samples were taken from the clay vessels, which proved to contain organic material, seeds of various plants, some of which were familiar, and others that would require genetic analysis to identify. The skeletons were studied in place before being carefully prepared for removal. Initial examination suggested they were all adults, 2 males and 1 female, and all had been in good health at the time of their passing. There were no signs of violence or disease. It appeared they had simply chosen to remain in the chamber until the end came naturally. The central object in the upper chamber remained the greatest mystery. Despite extensive analysis with every piece of non-invasive equipment the team could acquire, its composition remained unknown. It was not stone, not metal, not ceramic, not any organic material they could identify. The working theory was that it might be some kind of composite material, but that raised even more questions. How could a people living 10,000 years ago have developed material science sophisticated enough to create something that 21st century technology could not fully analyze? Timothy made the next breakthrough, though it came from an unexpected direction. He had been studying the photographs of the symbols on the object, running them through various pattern recognition algorithms, when he noticed something. The symbols were not randomly distributed across the surface. When he mapped their positions and orientations, a pattern emerged. The symbols formed a mathematical progression, a sequence that started at one point on the object and spiraled outward in a pattern that matched the golden ratio. This discovery suggested that the creators of the object understood advanced mathematics, specifically the mathematical relationships that appear throughout nature and have been used in art and architecture for thousands of years. But the golden ratio was supposedly first described by the ancient Greeks, thousands of years after this object was created. Either the people who made this object had independently discovered these mathematical principles, or human knowledge was far more advanced in prehistory than anyone had believed possible. Raymond spent hours sitting in the upper chamber, just looking at the object and the paintings that surrounded it. He was searching for context, for any clue that might help explain what they had found. On the 19th day of the expedition, he called the team together and shared his theory. "I think this object was not made here," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "Look at the paintings. They show it arriving, not being constructed. The people who brought it here, who sealed this cave, They were not the creators, they were guardians. Something happened, or they knew something was going to happen, and they decided the object needed to be hidden and protected. The three people in the lower chamber, they were volunteers. They stayed here to ensure that the object remained undisturbed. Elena nodded slowly. That would explain the ritual depicted in the paintings. They were not worshipping it, they were containing it. But containing it from what? From whom? Marcus spoke up, his voice betraying his exhaustion. Maybe the better question is, what does it do? Because if they went to all this trouble, if they sacrificed 3 lives to guard it, then it must do something. It must have some purpose or function that made it worth all of this. The discussion continued late into the night, theories building upon theories, each one more speculative than the last. But they all agreed on one thing. The object could not remain a secret. The scientific community needed to know about this discovery. It would change everything from their understanding of human technological development to the very timeline of civilization itself. The decision to go public was made carefully. They would release the information through proper academic channels, peer-reviewed journals, with all the documentation and evidence needed to support their claims. They knew the response would be skeptical. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and what they were claiming was as extraordinary as it got. But they had the evidence. They had the cave, the seal, the radiocarbon dates, the paintings, the carvings, the burials, and, most importantly, they had the object itself. The press conference was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late November. The team had returned to civilization, though Marcus had left 2 graduate students at the site to maintain security. The 3 skeletons had been carefully transported to a university laboratory for further study. The object, however, remained in the cave. It was simply too valuable and too mysterious to risk moving until they better understood what it was. 2 days before the scheduled announcement, something happened that changed everything again. Marcus received a call at 2 in the morning from one of the graduate students at the site. Her voice was shaking, barely coherent. He had to ask her to repeat herself 3 times before he understood what she was saying. The object was glowing. Marcus, Elena, Raymond, and Timothy were back at the cave site by dawn, making the drive in record time despite the treacherous desert roads. When they descended into the upper chamber, they found the 2 graduate students huddled near the entrance, their faces pale with fear and wonder. The object was indeed glowing, emitting a soft light that seemed to come from deep within its structure. The light pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat, and as it pulsed, the symbols on its surface appeared to rearrange themselves. It was as if the object was alive, responding to something, communicating somehow. Elena set up monitoring equipment immediately, instruments that would measure electromagnetic radiation, sound waves, temperature changes, anything that might give them a clue about what was happening. The readings were strange, showing fluctuations that did not correspond to any known phenomenon. The object was generating some kind of field, weak but detectable, that extended about 10 feet in all directions. Timothy was the first to notice the other change. The paintings on the walls were different. Not dramatically different, but subtly altered. Details had appeared that he was certain had not been there before. In one painting, a human figure now held something in their hands, an object that looked like a smaller version of the one in the center of the chamber. In another, the night sky showed an additional star, bright and prominent, in a position that did not correspond to any star they had previously documented. Raymond approached the object slowly, drawn by a compulsion he could not quite explain. As he got closer, the pulsing of the light seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat. He could feel it resonating in his chest, a strange sensation that was not quite sound and not quite touch. When he was about 5 feet away, he stopped. On the surface of the object, one of the symbols was glowing more brightly than the others. As he watched, it seemed to rotate, orienting itself toward him. "It knows we are here," Raymond said quietly. "It is reacting to our presence." Over the next 48 hours, the team documented everything. The glow persisted, gradually growing brighter. More changes appeared in the paintings, subtle shifts that seemed to be adding detail and context to the story told on the walls. Elena photographed every change, comparing them to the original images they had taken weeks earlier. What emerged was a more complete narrative. The paintings now showed more clearly what the original artists had been trying to depict. The object was not from this world, at least not in the conventional sense. It had come from somewhere else, brought by travelers who had journeyed vast distances. These travelers had given the object to certain humans, chosen for reasons that were not made clear. They had instructed these chosen ones on how to care for the object, how to protect it, and most importantly, when to awaken it. The concept of awakening suggested that the object had been dormant, waiting for something. The carvings in the lower chamber now made more sense. The cycle of 12 moons was not just a record of time passing, it was a countdown, a way to mark when the object should be opened or activated. But 10,000 years ago something had changed. The Guardians had decided not to awaken the object. Instead, they had sealed it away, and 3 of their number had volunteered to remain with it, to ensure it stayed dormant. Marcus found himself wondering what had changed their minds. What had happened 10,000 years ago that made the Guardians decide the world was not ready for what the object contained or represented? And more pressingly, what did it mean that the object was now awakening on its own? On the 3rd day of the glow, the object began to make sound. It was not quite a hum, and not quite a tone, but something in between. The sound seemed to bypass the ears entirely, resonating directly in the bones and teeth of anyone in the chamber. It was not unpleasant, but it was deeply unsettling. The team took turns maintaining watch over the object, no one willing to leave it unobserved. Elena was on watch when the change happened. The glow suddenly intensified, becoming almost too bright to look at directly. The symbols on the surface began to move rapidly, spiraling toward the center point that Timothy had identified weeks earlier. The sound increased in intensity, building to a crescendo that made Elena drop to her knees, pressing her hands against her ears, even though she knew it would do no good. Then, abruptly, everything stopped. The glow vanished. The sound ceased. The chamber was plunged back into the darkness, broken only by the artificial lights the team had installed. For a long moment, Elena could not move, could not even breathe. Then she reached for her radio with shaking hands. "Something happened," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You all need to get down here now." When the team assembled, they found that the object had changed. The surface, which had been smooth and unbroken, now showed a seam, a thin line that ran around the equator of the sphere, so fine that it would have been invisible, if not for the faint glow that emanated from within. The object could be opened. The debate that followed was intense. Should they open it? Did they have the right to open it? The ancient guardians had sealed this cave and sacrificed 3 lives to keep the object secure. What gave modern archaeologists the authority to undo 10,000 years of careful protection? But Raymond, always pragmatic, pointed out the obvious. The object had opened itself, or at least it had begun the opening process. It was responding to something, perhaps the mere fact of human presence after millennia of isolation. Whatever the Guardians had feared 10,000 years ago, the object itself seemed to believe that time had passed. It was ready to be revealed. The decision was made to document everything and then carefully attempt to open the object. They would do it in stages, monitoring for any changes or dangers. If anything seemed threatening, they would stop immediately and seal the chamber until they could bring in more expertise. Marcus was given the honor of making the attempt. He approached the object slowly, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he reached out. The surface was warm to the touch, warmer than the ambient temperature of the cave. He found the seam and gently applied pressure, testing whether it would give. It opened with surprising ease. The two hemispheres separated smoothly, as if they had been opened yesterday rather than being sealed for 10 millennia. Inside, nestled in what appeared to be some kind of organic padding that had somehow not decayed, was another object. This inner object was smaller, about the size of a human hand, and appeared to be made of crystal. It was perfectly transparent, but as Marcus carefully lifted it into the light, colors seemed to dance within its structure. Refracting through the crystal were images, three-dimensional scenes that moved and changed. It was like looking into a window to another place, another time. The team crowded around, their scientific detachment forgotten in the face of such wonder. The images in the crystal showed landscapes, some familiar and others utterly alien. There were mountains and oceans, forests and deserts. There were structures, buildings of some kind, though their architecture was unlike anything from any human civilization past or present. And there were people, or at least figures that moved and acted like people, though the details were too small and too fluid to see clearly. Timothy was recording everything, his camera capturing the images as they flowed through the crystal. Elena was taking measurements, trying to understand what kind of material could contain moving images without any apparent power source. Raymond simply stared, his weathered face showing an emotion that none of them had seen before. It might have been joy or terror, or perhaps both at once. As they watched, the images in the crystal began to slow. The scenes became more focused, more deliberate. They were being shown something specific. A landscape appeared that looked familiar. Desert, mountains, and what might have been the same canyon they were standing in, though the geography was slightly different. The camera perspective, if it could be called that, moved through this landscape, following a path that led to a cave. But this was not the cave they were in. The entrance was different, located in a different part of the canyon. The crystal seemed to be showing them the location of something else, another site, that might contain more answers. Marcus felt his heart racing as he realized what they were looking at. This was not just an artifact. It was a map, a guide, a message left by the ancient guardians, or perhaps by the original owners of the object. They were being directed to continue the search, to follow the trail that had been laid down 10,000 years ago. The implications were staggering. If there was another site, another cache of objects or information, then everything they had found here might be just the beginning. The story was far larger and far more complex than they had imagined. Elena was the first to speak, her voice filled with awe. They planned this. The guardians, or whoever came before them, they left a trail. They knew that eventually someone would find this cave, would open the object, and would be ready to learn more. This is not an ending. It is a beginning. Raymond nodded slowly. We need to find that other location. We need to continue what they started, but we also need to be very careful. There was a reason they sealed this away. There was something they feared, some danger they were protecting the world from. We do not know if that danger still exists, or if the passage of time has made it irrelevant. The team spent the next week preparing for a new expedition. The crystal object, now referred to simply as the guide, continued to show them images, each one adding more detail to the map it was creating. The new location was about 15 miles from their current position, higher in the mountains, in an area that was even more remote and difficult to access. Before they left, Marcus took one last look at the paintings in the cave. In the shifting light of their lamps, he could have sworn he saw new details appearing, more of the story revealing itself. One painting in particular caught his attention. It showed a group of people, perhaps the same three who were buried in the lower chamber, standing at the entrance to the cave. They were looking out at a sunset, their faces turned toward the dying light. In their hands they each held something small, something that glowed faintly. Marcus realized with a start that he understood what he was seeing. The guardians had not sealed themselves in out of duty alone. They had done it with hope. They believed that someday Someone would find what they had hidden. Someone would understand the message they had left. And when that day came, the world would be ready for what came next. As the team hiked toward the new location, following the coordinates that the guide provided, Marcus thought about the nature of knowledge and responsibility. The ancient guardians had possessed something extraordinary, something that could change the world. But they had also possessed the wisdom to recognize that their world was not ready for it. They had hidden it away, preserved it for a future that they would never see. Now, 10,000 years later, humanity stood at that threshold again. What they found in the days and weeks to come would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. But Marcus knew with a certainty that went beyond mere professional confidence that they were meant to find this. The Guardians had been waiting for them, waiting for the right moment in human history when the world would be ready to learn the truth about its past and its future. The second site was located in a high mountain valley accessible only by a narrow trail that switchbacked up the canyon wall. When they finally reached it after a grueling 6-hour climb, they found an opening in the rock face that had been hidden by a rock slide at some point in the distant past. It took 2 days of careful excavation to clear the entrance, enough for a person to enter. Inside, they found a chamber even larger than the first and filled with wonders that made their previous discoveries pale in comparison. There were dozens of objects, each one carefully preserved and labeled with the same symbol system they had seen on the sphere. There were more paintings and carvings, telling a story that spanned not just thousands, but perhaps millions of years. And at the center of it all was something that should not have existed in any timeline that made sense. It was a library, though not in any conventional sense. Crystalline structures, similar to the guide but much larger, stood in precise arrangements. Each one contained vast amounts of information, images, and sounds and concepts that would take years to fully decode. The story they told was one of repeated civilizations, cycles of rise and fall, of knowledge gained and lost and gained again. Humanity, it seemed, was not the first intelligent species to inhabit this planet. It was not even the second or third. The Earth was ancient beyond measure, and its history was written in layers that went far deeper than conventional archaeology had ever imagined. The Guardians 10,000 years ago had been preserving the knowledge of those who came before, protecting it so that when humanity was finally ready, it could learn from the mistakes and triumphs of its predecessors. As Marcus stood in that mountain library, surrounded by evidence of deep time and deep history, he understood why the Guardians had chosen to seal it away. This knowledge was powerful, transformative, and potentially dangerous. It challenged every assumption about human uniqueness and importance. It suggested that the patterns of history were not unique to humanity, but were instead part of a larger cosmic cycle. But he also understood why it was being revealed now. Humanity in the 21st century faced challenges that required a longer view, a perspective that stretched beyond individual lifetimes, or even individual civilizations. Climate change, resource depletion, the development of artificial intelligence, these were not new problems in the grand scheme of things. Other species on this same planet had faced similar crises. Some had survived and evolved, others had not. The information in this mountain library could provide a roadmap, not for avoiding the challenges, but for navigating them with wisdom gained from countless previous attempts. It was a gift from the deep past to the uncertain future, wrapped in stone and crystal, and protected by guardians who understood that the timing had to be right. The team spent 3 months cataloging and studying what they found. The press conference that had been postponed was now scheduled again, but the story they had to tell was far bigger than they had originally imagined. The response from the scientific community would be mixed, they knew. Skepticism was healthy and necessary, but the evidence was overwhelming. The objects could be studied, the dates verified, the story corroborated through multiple independent lines of inquiry. Helena, working late one night with the crystal structures, made one final discovery that tied everything together. Hidden within the largest of the crystals was a message, rendered in a pictographic language that was surprisingly easy to understand once you recognized what you were looking at. The message was simple but profound. It said essentially that knowledge without wisdom was dangerous, but wisdom without knowledge was powerless. It said that every civilization faced a moment when it had to choose between repeating the mistakes of the past and learning from them. It said that the guardians who had sealed these caves were not trying to hide the truth, but to preserve it until the time was right. And it said something else, something that made Elena call the others to come immediately. The message indicated that there were more sites, more caches of information and artifacts scattered across the globe. The cave in Utah was just one node in a worldwide network of preserved knowledge. If humanity was ready, if it could prove itself worthy of the trust the ancient guardians had placed in the future, then the other sites would reveal themselves in time. The coordinates were not given explicitly. Instead, the message provided clues, puzzles that would require cooperation across cultures and disciplines to solve. It was a test, but also an invitation. The Guardians had believed in the potential of future humanity. They had faith that eventually intelligence and wisdom would align. And when that happened, the full story of Earth's deep history would be revealed. As Marcus stood outside the cave on the last day of the expedition, watching the sun set over the Utah desert, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. They had been given a gift, but also a burden. The knowledge they had uncovered would change the world, but how it changed would depend on the choices made by countless people in the years to come. He thought about the three guardians who had sealed themselves in the cave 10,000 years ago. They had given everything to protect this knowledge, trusting that their sacrifice would matter, that it would serve a purpose beyond their own lifetimes. Now, looking out at the same landscape they must have seen, Marcus made a silent promise. He would honor their trust. He would ensure that the knowledge they had preserved was used wisely, shared responsibly, and protected for future generations, who would continue the work of understanding. The story of the sealed cave would be told around the world. Books would be written, documentaries made, careers built on the study of what had been found. But for Marcus, the real story was simpler and more profound. It was about continuity across vast stretches of time, about the belief that knowledge and wisdom could be preserved and passed down, about the hope that each generation could learn from those who came before. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus wondered if any of them had been cataloged in those ancient crystal libraries. He wondered what other secrets they might hold, what other messages might be waiting to be discovered. The cave had been sealed for 10,000 years, but the story it told stretched back much further and pointed forward to a future full of possibility. The world would never be quite the same after the announcements were made. But that, Marcus reflected, was exactly what the Guardians had intended. Change was necessary, growth was inevitable, and understanding was the bridge that connected past to future. The cave was open now, its secrets revealed, but the journey of discovery had only just begun. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson the ancient Guardians had left behind. Knowledge was not a destination, but a journey, and every answer uncovered revealed new questions waiting to be asked. The cave had been locked for 10,000 years, but in opening it, humanity had unlocked something far more valuable than artifacts or information. It had unlocked a new understanding of its place in the vast sweep of time, and with that understanding came both humility and hope. The desert wind whispered through the canyon as the team packed up their equipment for the final time. Tomorrow they would return to civilization, to press conferences and peer reviews, to skepticism and acclaim. But tonight, they stood in the presence of mystery and wonder, guardians in their own way of knowledge that would shape the future in ways they could only begin to imagine. And somewhere, in the deep places of the earth, other caves waited to be found. Other stories waited to be told, continuing the legacy that had begun before human civilization existed and would continue long after the current age had passed into history. The Guardians had done their job well, and now it was time for a new generation of Guardians to carry the torch forward into an uncertain but undeniably fascinating future.